helping students and healthcare professionals not just survive, but thrive with a purpose. This is the CMDA Student Pulse podcast with your host, Bill Reichart, National Director of CMDA Campus Ministries.
Well, welcome to another episode of CMDA Student Pulse podcast. I'm Bill Reichart, National Director for our Campus and Community Ministries here at CMDA, and I have Alan Fadling. Welcome, Alan.
Thanks for the chance to have this conversation.
Well, Alan, before we jump in, let me give our listening and viewing audience just a heads up a little bit about your work in ministry. I trust, though, that there are going to be many individuals who are familiar with your writing, particularly the books entitled Unhurried Living, Leadership. In fact, they're somewhere around here. I placed them, but I have a bunch of your books, and they've been a great ministry to me. Alan, you are a graduate MDiv of Fuller Theological Seminary, and of course, president and founder of the ministry Unhurried Living, inspiring people to rest deeper. I love this. Live fuller and lead better. That's a great mission. Alan speaks and consults internationally with organizations like Saddleback, InterVarsity, Crew, which I was on staff with Crew about 17 years prior to this work.
Oh, wonderful.
And other ministries. Again, I mentioned your writing, award-winning author of Unhurried Leader, Unhurried Life, and was honored with the Christianity Today Award of Merit in Spirituality, and co-author with your wife, Jem, on a book called What Does Your Soul Love? And you're a trained spiritual director and live again in California with your wife, Jem. So thank you again for being part of this conversation. But we're talking about a book that I didn't mention in the intro. It's on anxiety. Non-anxious life, living the non-anxious life. Explain, maybe just give us a little backdrop, given you've written on subjects very, adjacent to this topic. Why this book on the non-anxious life?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I proposed this book 2 weeks into the COVID pandemic, 2 weeks in. And my pitch was to say, look, the more I talk about hurry with busy leaders, the more I realize that for many of us, anxiety is the primary motor of hurry for us. There's many motors for hurry. There's many engines, many sources, but anxiety is a big one. And it's a big one for me. It's very personal. What I didn't realize is what these last few years would look like in terms of our shared anxiety levels as a culture. And it was a very different book by the time I was done writing it. But it's personal, but it's also, I think, universal. Yeah.
Oh, it is. And of course, anxiety, though, is a little bit different than just, let's just peel anxiety away from some of the other kinds of ways that we describe life. There's certain stress levels that we all face. There's worries, there's concerns, but anxiety is, I think you defined it in your book, characteristically different. Could you kind of explain how it's different, maybe a little set apart from some of maybe the day-to-day concerns we often face?
Yeah. So I like to say that, anxiety is more than just circumstantial unpleasantness, as you say, stressors or unpleasant surprises or whatever. It's more of an internal orientation, I find. One of the things I said in the book, and this again is very personal, is that I realized that my practice of anxiety, especially the worry practice that anxiety provokes, is a kind of practicing the absence of God. My anxious orientation sort of presumes that God with me is not a major factor in my well-being, even though I would cognitively say, of course, God with me matters the most. But my anxiety says, no, actually, you'd better wrestle and worry and ruminate and forecast and predict and figure out. Spend a lot of energy that way if you'd like to be safe in the near and distant future. So that's what I mean when I say I find my anxiety as a kind of orientation, which is a different orientation than one that the scriptures recommend, which is, the Lord is my shepherd. And I shall not want. That's a different orientation than my anxiety has suggested.
Well, you touch on this in a profound way with the verse Colossians 2, 6-7. So then, just as, in that phrase, just as you received Christ, continue to live your lives in him. And I think that is such an important orientation that be easy to gloss over, but it really means the gospel, as important as it was for our salvation, is so just as important, just as relevant for our ongoing sanctification. It's I don't know if you're familiar with Jack Miller and his works and writings, but he used to talk about preaching the gospel to ourselves every day, because we can forget that orientation. And so we need the gospel. And I think, the tendency can be, as I think you described it, was we can live in this performance oriented, like somehow, okay, God, you need to do what was required to save me, but now I've got this. And no. Just as he was important in our salvation, he is for our ongoing sanctification. Unpack that some more for us.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree more. Seriously. I had a mentor who loved to teach on the theme of grace. One of the things he loved to say was, remember, just as surely as you have been saved by grace, you live by grace, you work by grace, you lead, you serve. Everything you do is grace. Grace is not just the doorway by which we enter this life in Christ. Grace is the pathway. Every single step is a step of response to the generous and empowering presence of God. Again, that's a very different orientation than my anxiety orientation is. And so I find that it helps me immensely to remember that my life is something that is being given to me moment to moment as a gift from God. It is not a paycheck I am earning moment to moment or day to day. Because if it's a paycheck I'm earning, that is a treadmill. I will never get off that.
Exactly.
But if it's a gift I'm receiving, I can keep living in that generous and empowering presence, even when stressors are at their greatest.
Stay with us. More Student Pulse podcast in just a moment.
Are you ready for the CMDA National Convention 2025? Join us next May in historic St. Charles, Missouri, on the banks of the beautiful Missouri River. We'll get together in the heartland of America with easy access to everything the area has to offer. Stay in exceptional accommodations at the convention venue or choose a historic B&B nearby. Gather with well over 1,000 of your friends and colleagues from all over the country in our largest convention to date. Lowest price registration is going on now throughout the conference, so don't miss the opportunity to join us. Go to natcon.cmda.org to register.
Again, there's so much here. This book is just rich and dense with so many things. It's not one of these quick reads. You really just slows you down. I know I was led to be thinking very deeply on many of the things you touched on. One of the things that really was a delight for me to read and reflect is a verse in the Sermon on the Mount about the birds, birds of the bird watching, because you say, just as Jesus wants me to overcome my habits of worry, he suggests a bit of bird watching. And I want to let you know, I told you, earlier I was on staff with Crew, and one of the things you do, you raise support. And this verse I cling to it every day. Say, okay, Lord, you care for me. You love me more than the birds. You care for the birds. How much more then still will you love and will care for me and provide? So, talk about this idea as you talk about bird watching and why that's so helpful for us.
Yeah, I just think Jesus is an absolute genius in the way that he helps or seeks to help us enter into this abundant life that he came to offer us. Part of that abundance is an abundance of well-being or of peace. And in the Sermon on the Mount, maybe one of his best sort of teachings, mentoring kind of passages. And, he says, don't worry. And then he basically says, look at the birds. And essentially he's saying, do they look worried to you? And it's beautiful. I get to sit here at home. Most of my work happens, unless I'm traveling, from a home office where I can look in the backyard at a number of bird feeders. And I've gotten to know our neighborhood community of birds. Some of them are here year round. Some migrate in from Central America. Some are surprising, some are common. But what they seem to share together is I never see one of them looking frantic or anxious. They seem as though they are confident they will be cared for. And I've been letting them mentor me in that kind of simple confidence. Part of the spirit of, I think, what Jesus says is, they're not tending gardens. They're not setting up silos to prepare for the future. And yet somehow God is taking good care of them daily. Now, don't you think if you, someone who does work and perhaps does plan ahead a bit and seeks to be wise, don't you think maybe you can count on a father who would care at least as well as you for you as he's cared for these little birds? And so it's a kind of meditation that helps replace my anxious rumination. And that's been helping me a lot.
Yeah. It takes it out of the kind of the ethereal. It makes it practical. You see that very practical representation. Now, of course, you got to chase away those anxious squirrels out of those bird feeders too.
That's a different story.
I know, and you mentioned that too, as different ways of looking at anxiety. But we'll move on from that. There's certainly some great metaphors you have early in the book. One thing you say in the book too, which has been a tremendous gift for me in thinking about those times when I'm prone to be anxious, is you say, notice how often God reminds Israel of their Exodus story with him. It is though that grace in their history was so rich that they had begun to fully mind, that they hadn't, that is, begun to fully mind his goodness. It's beautiful when we recall moments of great goodness in our own history and relish that grace. That has been a discipline that has really helped my wife and I, well, first of all, marking out those times when he's good, building those 12 stones in a sense, as Israel did when they crossed the Jordan into the promised land. Something that's physical and tangible. We do it by writing the way God had provided, and he provided in some very amazing, flashy ways and some very quiet and subtle ways, but always marking those out. And then having that book we could go back to, because mine was the hymn that says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. I mean, there's a propensity for me to forget, to not remember well God's goodness, thinking as if every new occasion of anxiety and stress is somehow a unique challenge to God, when I can be so easily reminded that he's done that tenfold, 20-fold in the past. And so having that as a as a way of kind of a monument is so helpful. So talk about that and how that can be helpful for us as we struggle perhaps with anxiety.
So this, again, I think is a way of saying a grace orientation is a great help in coming to places of deeper peace. In one of the chapters, I highlighted, in Paul's letters, every single letter starts with the language of grace. Every single letter ends with the language of grace. But also, every letter of Paul begins also with peace. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. See, grace and peace are wonderful companions. They're very close friends. So to your point, learning how to rehearse the grace that has come to me in the past, the practice of gratitude is a beautiful antidote to anxiety, not just in the moment, though it is, but also as a kind of training. When I become the kind of person who notices and remembers and acknowledges grace in the distant past, in the recent past, in the immediate past, what it does is it trains me to notice grace now, especially if now feels stressful, if now feels difficult, if now feels challenging, if now feels very unpleasant and even painful. Rehearsing grace in the past helps me notice grace now. Now, sometimes grace in the present moment kind of has come in a darker shade than I might prefer. It may not feel comforting. It may not feel easy. It may not feel nice, but it's grace nonetheless. And so there's this opportunity to sort of train ourselves in the noticing of grace in the moment by noticing and rehearsing grace in my story.
That's great. Well, as Alan, I mentioned to you earlier, a lot of the listeners are in very high stressful, high demanding professions. They're training, and those training years are very challenging. They're competing at a very high level for residency slots, which I did not understand until I was working alongside medical students, and just how stressful that is, and the anxiety that's all wrapped up into will they get that slide, and what their specialty is, and so there's a lot that's happening right now, and that's just on a good day. There's you can add so much more that can go on in their life if they've got families, and there's financial concerns, and there's all kinds of things outside of just their training alone. So I love the way you unwrapped, and I thought maybe it'd be helpful to kind of give a practical lesson on how to address anxiety. And you unwrapped the Philippians 4:6-7 and touch on those 4 points. And so I was hoping maybe you could unpack that idea, maybe an exercise that our listeners could work through to help them better, kind of address, full on the issues of anxiety when anxiety seems to well up. So could you do that?
Yeah. Well, so I think one of the things that's helped me is to realize that my anxiety is a kind of, I don't know, you can almost say it's a kind of energy. Now the question is, where am I going to point that? And how will I navigate it? Sometimes my prayers have sounded something like, God, please take this anxiety away. That has never really worked for me.
Okay.
What has worked, and that's not really Paul's counsel in that Philippians 4 passage. In a sense, he's suggesting redirect that anxious energy in the direction of prayer. So I think one of the things that we can learn to do is pray our anxieties rather than pray God will take away our anxieties. We can realize our anxieties are probably a really good indicator of something that matters to us. Now that, in the sense, that energy is good. The anxiety part of it is when I forget that God's caring is bigger than my caring about things. That's what prayer helps me remember. Prayer is a way of saying, oh Lord, this has just shocked me, surprised me. It's really making me nervous. I'm imagining scenarios in the near future that are really frightening. Would you help me remember that you are shepherding me now? You'll be shepherding me in 10 minutes. You'll be shepherding me in that moment I'm envisioning a day or two or a week or two down the road. That is a bigger reality than my anxious care is.
Stay with us. More Student Pulse podcast in just a moment.
And so I think C.S. Lewis talked about, if we're not praying about that which matters to us, we may not be praying very much. And anxiety is an indicator of that. So I just like to say to people, learn to pray your anxieties rather than ruminate your anxieties. Learn to be as honest about what you're feeling and thinking in the presence of God as you can possibly do. Nothing you're feeling is a defect. It's just a fact. It's just what's happening. And God sees it and knows it. And what God longs for is a place of communion with us exactly where we find ourselves, including in those moments of profound anxiety. So that's what I've been learning, is learning to pray my anxieties rather than pray that God would remove my anxieties.
You also talk about, well, I guess this is tied in, the idea of petition and bring that situation to know before God that He is he's able to act on our behalf, that he is with us, he's near to us. And so asking, and then I think this speaks to the gratitude piece, is thanksgiving. Gratitude, as you bring up, and then, you know, be honest with God about those requests. I mean, God knows us better than we know ourselves. There's no sense playing that game with God if somehow, well, you know, it may not sound polished or holy for me to ask this, but you know what? He knows our desires, and it's best to just be honest with him with those bold, audacious requests as they might be. And I think taking the anxiety to the Lord in prayer is about building, like you said, that communion with him, that relationship. And that's what he desires, right? He wants that intimacy, that relationship with his sons and his daughters.
He really does.
Well, again, I feel like we're doing a flyover view. Is there anything? Let me give you this as a opportunity. You know, you can speak directly to these students. You know, in general terms, some of the things they go through, the stressors they perhaps have. As a shepherd, as one who works closely with individuals in the counseling and being a spiritual director, what would you say? How would you encourage our listeners right now, these students?
Yeah. Well, maybe I would say something similar to what I think Jesus, says to us, and that is to say, one, when Jesus says, "Don't worry," I don't think what he's saying is you knock off all that worrying. That's wrong. Worry's a sin. Like, I just don't think that helps anybody. I think that makes more worry.
Yeah, we worry about our worries.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my goodness. So I think what we've got to understand is that Jesus is coming to us with empathy.
Yes.
He sits on a throne of grace. That's the throne we approach when we're overwhelmed by our cares, overwhelmed by certain stressors that are in our lives. So when Jesus says, don't worry, it's more in the spirit of, I'd like to teach you how you could live free of worry. You know, you don't have to. Actually, is worry helping you any? Is your situation better for the habits of worry that you've developed over the years? You might discover that you could still care a lot about unpleasant surprises, great stressors, certain hardships, whatever. You could still care about those without worrying about those. And you could learn the practice. One of the metaphors I really like is, you know, if you've got a submarine down at the depths, there is an immense pressure pushing on that submarine. Why doesn't it get crushed? Because there is a pressure equal to or greater pushing from within. That's the invitation, I think, when we find ourselves in a vocational situation as the students we're talking to, but also just in our current cultural situation.
Yeah.
There have not been very many more stressful seasons of my life than this year, the last couple of years. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You just, everywhere I look, something unpleasant, something unpredictable, something that feels like it's never going to get better comes at me. Stress, pressure. What I'm learning is that I can learn to develop a sense of communion with God that pushes back against that. Rather than, God, would you please fix everything so nothing stresses me? That's not the world I live in. It's not the world any of us live in. But Lord, would you be the one in me pushing back against those stressors and pressures that are there? This is where practicing the presence of God is an invitation for us. And for me, that practice is sometimes just as real time as, you know, something hits my email mailbox or a piece of news crosses my path and I feel it in my body, in my mind, in my emotions, just anxiety, 9 out of 10, you know, there it is. I have not found the button where I can make that go away.
Right.
But what I can do is when that arises in me, I can say, Lord, right here, I need shepherding and you are shepherding me. That Psalm 23 is such a great passage to talk about all the ways God's with us in all kinds of situations. I'm exhausted. God's with me. I'm hungry and thirsty. God's with me. I feel overwhelmed by the shadow of death. God is with me. I'm in the middle of enemies. God prepares a table. Like all of this happens in God's shepherding presence. That becomes that inner pushback that enables me to bear the push that comes at me. So that's what I would want to say. Jesus is inviting us to learn from him his way of peace. He is a Prince of Peace, and he knows how to help us enter into that kind of life in the actual circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Well, you write like you speak, with with a shepherd's heart, with the love of God, and offering the grace that comes with drawing near to our wonderful Savior. And I think this book will be. I listen. I know our students read a lot. They've got busy lives.
Oh boy!
But in a discipline of being able to learn more about the Lord that we serve, to be able to take some of these principles and inculcate them and get them worked into our heart and soul. I encourage students, get a copy of this book. We're going to put we'll put a link in the show notes, and of course, Alan, your many other books are just as valuable. We're grateful, and there's in fact, I even you did a devotion recently too, I believe.
Yeah, a year of slowing down, about a year and a half ago.
Yeah. So I would encourage, students get the books, or listen to the audiobooks, but just don't listen to them at 1.5 speed. I mean, that would kind of defeat the unhurried life purpose, wouldn't it? I mean,
might not be best.
Might be best. But Alan, I just appreciate your ministry, the gift you are, and the ways that you're serving the body of Christ through your writing, through your teaching. Thank you for being a guest here, and again, we'll make all this information available in the show notes. So thank you for joining us, Alan.
Oh, it's great to be able to be with you, Bill. It was a real treat.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. CMDA's Student Pulse podcast is a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the organisation. CMDA is non-partisan and does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on Student Pulse podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members.